Hello and welcome. So, I want to talk about some tricks in Blender that give us effects like paint washes. So, for people who are used to traditional paints, quick wash, speed paints, things like that that are used when people are painting traditional miniatures, I think look really good when you're painting minis for Tailspire. And quite frankly, they're easy. So, if you've always been daunted by texture painting, the great reveal is you don't have to be that good at it. So in Blender, what I want to show you is this guy. So this guy is a sort of a Shoggothi shambling mound horror thing that I made for a physical game. So he's a printed mini that I did. But I was like, oh, I'll port him over to Tailspire. That'll work. And I wanted to get a paint job that looked a lot like how he looked in reality when I did my physical paint. And was like, okay, maybe I can leverage some quick wash sort of stuff. And so I figured out how to do that in some of the nodes. And I want to show you how simple this is. So the great reveal, poof, this is the entirety of the paint job I did. It was basically, I clicked on the model, I clicked on my base color, I said, all right, I want to paint a gradient. Look, there's my gradient. I dropped out a gradient, probably a little more colorful than that. And then I just painted the eyes with red or whatever. In fact, I think I still have that in my palette. And that was all I did. That takes all of the amount of time it's taken me to explain that that's what I did, and it's done. So you're wondering, how did I get this more wild looking high and low textures going on? And so that's what I want to talk about today. This goes through a process that is called making sort of cavity and peak and pointiness maps. And these are used for a variety of neat things, but essentially it all is what you might call a grunge map and a reverse of it. So what we're really doing here, and I'll show you what those images look like, is we're taking this base color image and we're using some nodes to combine it with these other two images, my peak map, which is sort of a black and white map that highlights peaks and high points on the model, and a cavity map, which is the reverse, and it highlights sort of these low areas. Now, a cavity map is going to work like a quick wash, where if you do a full wash and it dries and all the pigment sort of settles into the deep areas. And the peak map is going to act like almost like doing a quick dry brush over the surface. Now, I'll admit that for this demo that I'm going to show you, it looks really good on this guy. It gets more complex when you're putting on other miniatures, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But I want to show you the node setup, how I baked these files, what it all took to bring it all together. And so let's just show you the process. All right, so back in the shading tab, you'll see this organized chaos I have going on. You'll see that this was the base color, and you can see that, well, this is the baked version of how the beautiful map of the color on this guy baked out. And it's gorgeous and lovely. But we'll ignore the chaos for a moment because it all will make sense and become zen eventually. We're going to go over to what I'm going to call my low bake material. So this is, sometimes I set up a separate material that happens when I first start on a model. And this is where you go in and you create the normal map and some other things. So if you haven't created a normal map before, this will be a little bit new, but chances are if you've made it to this video, you have created a normal map already. So I'm going to shrink all this over to the side, and we've already got a normal map, so we don't need this, but we're going to use the same process. So in this sort of blank material that I've created, I'm going to add 3 other image texture nodes. So add image texture node, and I'm just going to copy and paste it right along. And if I was starting a miniature and I was getting ready to do my normal bake, I would go ahead and prep these nodes. So I'm going to go ahead and add these in. We'll call it the low demo cavity. And you know, if you've seen me work before, I like to set my base images as transparent. So I'll do that. And then we will go to another one here. Low demo peak or pointy or whatever. And the next one will be our low demo AO, which has a lot of uses. So we'll make one anyway. So if we've set up for our normal map bake, you'll remember that over here in our bake area, we have it set to cycles. And under our bake we have this, if it was set from when I baked my normal, it would be set on normal, and we would have this as select to active with our cage and everything. So assuming you just baked your normal, the next step would be to bake your ambient occlusion. So you select your AO node, change this to ambient occlusion, and leave everything else the same, and hit bake. Oh, select your high to low, your low to high, and then hit bake. I'm a liar. So we'll let that bake. Now, I'll say while this is baking, there's a few pitfalls with baking your cavity map, your AO, and your peaks. These rely on a lot of what's being rendered. So if you have other objects in the scene, or a spare miniature on the scene, or maybe you're using the same file for multiple models, if you have other objects set to render, they will affect the outcome. So, okay, that's perfect. That is exactly what I'd expect for my ambient occlusion map. So that's good. I'll leave that alone. Now let's just say I had some other things rendering, but maybe they were hidden. Let's just kind of play around for a second. And I were to bake the AO again with the same selection. All right, so this is what happens. And if you see this on your ambient occlusion map, if you see this on your cavity maps, things like that, and you go, well, that didn't look like the dough, it's because you have other objects being rendered. Now you're like, wait a minute, these aren't on, these are all invisible. I hit the invisible button. Well, that's not enough. You have to have them invisible and not rendering. Otherwise, they render in and affect your shadows. So just something to keep in mind is I'm going to rebake my AO since I messed it up, and it takes a minute. But that is a pitfall that I ran into, so I just want everyone to be aware of it. Make sure that you don't have other objects rendering. And remembering, rendering is the camera icon next to the object as opposed to just the viewport icon. All right, and we see that did correctly. Okay, now that our ambient occlusion is baked, and correctly baked, we're going to get ready to do our cavity map. Now the cavity and peak require a little additional setup in the shader of the high poly model. So I'm going to go to my high poly model, and if you didn't already have a material set for the high poly model, you can just create one by doing a new one, and you're going to see something like this. Now, what you want to set up here are going to be a series of nodes. First will be a geometry node, followed by a color ramp. And when I'm doing this, I like to just duplicate them so that I can have one for each. And this first one we will group. You can select a group of nodes, right-click, join in new frame, just so they're together. And if you didn't watch my node wrangling demo, you'll see me do some things like this in this demo because it's a good practice. So this one will be my cavity, that, cavity. And this one will be my peaks. And in each of these, I'm going to take the pointiness of the geometry as the factor for my color ramp, and then pull the color into the base color when I'm ready to do the actual bake of it. So pointiness to factor. For the cavity color ramp, I want to move the far end over to about a 0.4. So I'm just going to push it to a 0.4. And my high end, I'm moving over to about a 0.6. And that tends to work well for a cavity map, or some people call them grunge maps. For my peaks, I'm going to be reversing the location of these so that the dark is on the right and the white is on the left. And for this, I find that I like hanging around a 0.5 and this around 0.6. Now you can adjust these based off of what you find works for you or your model. Did I do that a little too far over? 1 second. It feels a little too far over because it should be 0.5 and this one is 0.6. Didn't look right. So let's do that again. Now, you can adjust these a little bit, but they're going to both end up hanging out in the middle in both cases. And you can also swap this over to be eased. That starts getting tweaky, but the general gist of these just being linear is fine. You're still going to get good results. But if you start playing around with it, you might be like, ooh, I like it this way better for this mini or that for this one. But I digress. So we're making the cavity map first. So the color of our cavity sort of setup here will go into the color of our base material, which is on our high poly mesh. And I have this actually already preset, and that's my bake prep, which you just saw me make again. So anyway, so color to color. And now we can go back to our low poly mesh. We can select our, and I may have done a pre-bake of this one, but we'll go back to our cavity and shift select our high poly mesh just the same as we do when we're baking our normal map and when we did our AO. And then we need to just change a little bit in our bake settings. So in our bake settings, we're going to change this to a diffuse bake. And we're going to get rid of the direct and indirect lighting contributions. We just want color. And that is also the base if you're ever baking your PBR, if you're baking your color out of multicolors, or if you are baking pretty much anything that you want as your flat color maps. So that's what that is. All right, so let's bake that cavity map. And it's done. And that is what we would expect of our cavity map. Awesome. Now, this is also just keep going in line with it. You go back to your high poly and you plug in your peak map to replace that cavity map. Go back, second verse, same as the first, grab that low and bake it. So I've got the right image selected, I've got my model selected, the settings are the same, and bake. And this is why when I'm prepping my models and getting ready to do my painting and I'm doing my normal map, I'll just go ahead and bake these other 3 images because it's just kind of in the flow of it. All right. And there's our peak map. So now you're wondering, well, what do I do with these? So I'm going to show you the setup I have and kind of how I should arrive at it within the space of the demo. I apologize. So we're going to go back. We'll hide our high poly. We just want our low poly. And we're going to just go ahead and say, hey, let's pretend you're doing this from scratch, Miss Ma'am, and make a new material. I don't have all my stuff set up. Okay. So we've made a new material. You know the drill. We're going to set up our normal maps. So let's just add image textures. So if I know what I'm doing here, I know I'm going to need an image texture for my normal map. I'm going to need an image texture for my base color, somewhere over here, an image texture for my cavity, an image texture for my peaks, and if I'm doing it right, I'm going to have an image texture for my AO and my metallics and my roughness. I actually know there's no metals on this figure, so I can skip that one. But let's just pretend I'm being smart and getting my setup done early. And now we're going to get a normal map node. If y'all know how to do that connection already, I'm sure you probably do if you're in this video. So let's select our normal. Oh, wrong one. There's a lot of things going on in this file, so grab the right one, color to color, normal to normal. All right, now he looks right. I'm gonna, so I don't have to stare at him being so bright. Let's drop that down just for my eyes. All right, so now let's start with this one. So we're gonna make a new base color. So this is the idea that we're just gonna have one base color and the rest of these are gonna feed off of it. So let's do a young base color. This is sort of my young Shogothian creature. And here, let's grab this guy as our peaks. I like to do my highlights first, but people can do it however they want. So let's see. There's low demo peak. So I have that node ready to go. And this one will be my low demo cavity. All right. So now it's the question of how we lace these all together. Now, sometimes I'll have this big thing where I've got like stacked boxes. I found that sometimes for logic's sake, it's easier to just put them in a row. So for this guy, I'm going to add in a ramp. In fact, I know that I want to have a color ramp for both of these. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to want to add a mix node as well. And it'll be a color mix node. And I'll just go ahead and grab one of those and grab one of those here. So this is your little trio setup. And we'll talk about what things you can do to make it even more interesting. But for now, so for each of our sort of peak and high and lows, we're going to take the color as the factor. And then I'm going to take these and make the first one full white in value and the last one full transparent so that there's nothing there. Now, my goal here is that this is actually just giving us an alpha to act as our factor. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to do the color to color. We're going to change this ramp. I could probably just switch these first to where this one is full and this last one is transparent. So it's basically going white to transparent as our alpha factor there. We know that this node, the cavity, tends to work well as a multiply. So I would say for your shadows, make it multiply. And I'm just going to group these real quick so that I know what I'm doing. Join them in a frame. I'm not going to worry about labeling and coloring it right now. And these guys we're going to be doing with, let's just pretend that a lighten is what we want. And lightening is a little trickier, but we're going to call it that for now and join those in a new frame. And for our base color, this will all wire together like this. This color is going to go to be our primary here. And then the result of that becomes our primary here. And the result of that becomes our base color here. And we can already see what we've got. So we can see that just with the default, I didn't mess with it very much, shadows, we've already got a base figure that we can just go to town on. So let's get excited, and it's fun. All right, here we go. So just for node cleanup's sake, I'm going to shift drag over this line for my own sanity, hit G on my keyboard to move it. I'm going to do that twice just so I can kind of have a little node wrangling going on here so it's not quite as chaotic. So I'm just going to shift slash that and move that like here. Shift slash hold pick G to move that to here. You know what? Let's not do that. Let's just move these over a bit so they're not so cramped. There we go. Take advantage of the fact that this is an infinite space. All right, cool. So now let's go do a little bit of texture painting, and we'll go to texture paint. And we're going to go to our base color, and let's just make our base color something flat. So let's do something different than what I did in my real one. Let's just make him blue for now. Okay. Now you'll see that the lighten peaks are really bright. Let me go, I'm just going to make this guy like a darkish purple for now. We'll do something a little more magical. We'll go for that. And what I would say is the biggest boon you can do at this phase when you're doing a quick wash style mini paint is go ahead and get a gradient going. So gradients, you can just do a fill really quickly. So if I'm going to say this is, you know, that color to, I don't know, the same color but a bit darker, and I can just drag that over, and I'm going to get a lot of bang for my buck. And like the 2 seconds it took to do that, you've already got a little bit of a more dramatic sort of effect on your mini. Let's go ahead and just do the eyes real quick since I'm, you know, feel like doing them. All right. Now, you might be thinking, oh, this doesn't look as good as your last one. Well, that's where tweaking comes in. So I did a lot of tweaking on the other one, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. But that's all the texture painting we're going to do on this guy. So I'm going to go back into the shading tab. Now, the first problem is, I'll be honest, is the lightening. Getting the lighter colors on and getting it right is always tricky, and it really depends on your model. This is especially tricky with skin tones, which I'll kind of demo at the end of the video. So we can tweak a lot here. There are 2 places that I have right now that I can tweak. One is by changing the color of what's lightening it. So I can make this something more vibrant. I can make it brighter or darker, which will adjust sort of the intensity of what's going on. And if I'm going to choose, like, let's just go for let's go full electric pink here. But I can also adjust my sliders here. Now, if you're thinking like base physical paints, this is your spread. So like how far away from the peaks this is spreading. And so like if I start wedging these over this direction, I'm just highlighting the tippy tips of things. I'm really just doing very high peak touches. If I go further over this way, I'm getting a lot more spread. What you may find works, and this is going to be one of those crazy moment things, is you take this whole thing, copy it, and paste it again. And you can double stack it if you want. Remember, there's nothing that says you can't. So I'm just going to say, wait a minute. I want to have my high peaks. This is where it gets complicated. So let's say I want to have these super, super bright high peaks. And maybe these will just tuck that out a little bit for a minute. I want to have super crazy white, bright tip peaks like that. Well, I can do that, and those can be really wild. And then maybe I don't want the whole thing like that. So over here, I might say, okay, let me make this a little more casual and have it be something softer, or I can even change the color. So you can start stacking the amount of spread and flow and layering some of these things. Now, that said, there's that, and it's not too bad. But you can stick with just one. But this is to show you that once you have this set up, you have a lot of opportunity to play with it. Now, I'm going to unplug that by just, that was a control slash. So shift slash is create another node. Control slash is break it. So I broke it, but we're going to go back here. So we're going through this. The next option I want to show you that gives you some control is the RGBV curves. Okay, so if you've played with RGBV curves before, and I'm dyslexic, so I apologize. Someone's going to hear me say some of these things and be like, you got your acronym wrong. I'll be like, yeah, I might have. But, we all have our things. I'm going to add an RGB curve here. There we go. Now we've got a 3 stack, and this is where the default is. This is where this is. But this gives you a lot of control. So you can be like, oh, I want this kind of there. And then you can add, if you click on other places, you start adding in nodes that give you control over the ramping of the colors as they're peaking and growing. So you can have it be a little more spread, a little less spread, a little more contrasted. If you get too many of these little bubbles, every time you click this, it gives you a new bubble to play with. And it's very fun to play with. If you want to get rid of one, you just hit this X. But you can kind of change the curve of how this is affected and play with what you get. I love playing with the RGB curve of these sort of washes. All right, so I'm reasonably satisfied with that. All right, so now let's look at our shadows. So this is sort of me playing around, getting something fun in my highlights. And just to be clear though, this is called highlights because I've made this a lighten node. I could also do this as a color burn, and my highlights could be dark and shadowy. I could do this as a difference, and I don't know what that's going to do. It doesn't do a lot in this case, but you can play around with the different blend modes here. You have access to a lot, color dodge. In this case, it's not giving me much because the color I've picked, but if I pick another different color, I'm going to start getting different results, different ways to highlight hair, things like that. So that actually, the color burn actually was quite fun. And once again, the color burn, depending on what you pick, is going to change the end result. And this is one thing, I know I'm really talking everyone's ear off today, that I love about the options I have with the ramps and the peak maps, things like that, is I have a lot of control and I can really choose how I want this all to play out. So, so even though I'm saying I'm using this as a lighten node for demoing and what works in a lot of cases, it definitely does not have to be that. Just make it play and see what you like. But I'm going to stick with that for now. All right. So now that we've looked at the sort of what I set up as my peak tab, which is lightning or color burning or really whatever you want it to be, I'm going into where I did my cavity map. And right now I have it set as a pretty broad spread, and you're not seeing any change really because I have it set to white. And if you multiply with a white, you're not going to get very much change. So let's drop that down to be something dark. I won't do a full black. Let's go for very dark bluish purple. And here now we see where we've got sort of this cast multiply. And if we remember what our cavity map looks like, it has a lot of very generalized shadows, and we're seeing that kind of enforced on the figure. What we can do now, though, with the color ramp is sort of like we did with the lighten one. We can start shifting where those highs and lows end up. And if you're familiar with physical paint washes, this is where you get like pooling in. And this obviously would be like, wow, you overwashed that. Lots of coats. But where you have things that pool, like the coat starts to pool around in the deep areas, and you can soften that or soften the spread of it, things like that. Or if you just want, almost think, if you go for like Borderland style sort of where things are really just outlined, you can start doing that, and then you've got sort of this look and play with it. This starts looking fun, and now I'm like, wait, maybe this shouldn't be a shadow monster. This should be like a little fleshy beast. Depending on how I decide to take it. But there's a lot of opportunities there. And this kind of ties in with what I was talking about with color swapping, but in this case, the whole creature. So that is the basics of using these maps and ramps and how much bang for your buck you can get out of making a cavity map and a peak map. And if you're honest, I can probably just make this the cavity map and then swap the directions of these guys. And I think you pretty much end up getting mostly the same thing. Not exactly, but I'm not going to do that for now because I like the way I work. But regardless, that is what I've got. That is what you can do with it. So now that you've seen how much fun and how you can basically go from, sorry, what was our base image? Where I basically colored, that was all I did for the paint job. And now I've got sort of this wild looking creature. Let's talk about what it looks like on other models. Oh, no. All right. And now we have this sort of wild looking. Okay. So that is the basics of leveraging the cavity maps and peaks and all this. You can just play with it. So, and that all came from this basic, that all came from this very basic, just single gradient and a few dots image. And we have this sort of wild texture. So now you're like, oh, sweet, I love it. But that's not my image. And how do I get my image out? And I cover this a little bit in the color swap video, though there is a typo. I sort of misspoke something because my file, I didn't realize, had some uh, settings I'd changed in it that were messing up my exports. But to export this, it's very simple. All you have to do is make a new texture node, a new image texture. So when in doubt and you're watching my videos, I make a bunch of image texture nodes, and we'll call this the color bake. I'll just leave it generic for now. It's a terrible name. Anyway, and we are going to not change very much. The only difference is we get rid of selected to active because we're only baking the local colors. And I just hit bake. All right. And there is our image map painted from all of this. And we just take it and we save it. Now, in the other demo, you probably saw me go through this whole process of switching out the color ramping, and it was a mess. It's in the comments what it should be. But anyway, so there you go. And there's your the color texture that you'll wrap around this, and obviously finish your PBRs and get the glossiness all right, or don't. But that's that. So let's talk about how this works on other models. I just want to give some examples of just so you can kind of see how it plays out. This model showcases it really well, but how does it look in other use cases? So let's look at those. All right, so this is a mole model that I had working on. You may have seen a version of this in the Madio workshop. But what I want to show here is one of the issues that can come up when I'm working that I get fussy about, which is that if you are using just the basics that I showed, where you've got base image that's very simply colored. Just to give you an example of what I have here is actually just, flat. This is not, purposeful, but it's just flat, 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 flat. And I'm running it through the different highlight and shading sort of sort of setups that I have, it looks good in parts, and maybe I took some time to get the skin how I wanted, but the highlighting and shading then they don't necessarily work well on the other colors as much, and this is maybe I'm being fussy, but the details on some of the leather end up not having as much pop to them because they're relying on the highlight and shadows, tonal colors, and ramps that work well for maybe the skin, but don't work as well for other things. Case in point, down here, I have this currently as a color dodge. If I were to do this as a lighten, which you saw worked okay on the other model, it's putting the sort of skin tone lighten on here, and though I think that if I adjusted the ramp in the right ways, I could probably get that to where it really does, uh, make the skin tone have a nice, hue to it and gives it some good, highlights and pops, like, so, for example, like, around the ear and things like that, the lighten looks very good on that aspect of the face, but it looks terrible on the rest of the model. And if I swap this over to a color burn, which is what I had it on, oh, nope, not color burn. Bad day in the arena. All right, color dodge. It still looks pretty good, but it's not taking advantage of some of the hue that I'd picked. So if you're doing something where you have a lot of very different materials as part of your model, you might consider masking off and having like this whole section be like, okay, this section is for my so if you have that scenario, you might consider taking, all of this and scooting it up and having a duplicate of it for this is for the skin, this is for the leathers, this is for the cloth. And that adds a lot of complexity. And obviously, this video is not about adding complexity necessarily, but more just showing you what you could do with the washes. But just so you know, that is an option. You can start leveraging some layers with that. So that's one example. The other example I want to show you is on my sand skiff. All right, so this is another model that I've been working on. This one hasn't been published yet because I'm still struggling with the fact that these minis don't have collision, and so no one can ride the boat yet. But I love this model. I think it looks really good. It was fun to play with in real life, and I wanted to sort of port it into games so other people could have fun with it. But it's also set up very similarly. So if I go into my texture painting, now, and this is uh, this I actually re-imported the base color as what I was working on. So let me see if I've got. There we go. Take off the mask. And this is going to be hard to see because the way my UV map is showing in right now. But the base color is, once again, truly just a base flat color. I think maybe a little bit of gradients are involved. And certain colors are on the base color, such as the reds and some of the woods. I did end up on this one choosing to paint the leather and bone and some of these things a little bit separately, but that was primarily because I wanted to preserve what I'd worked on with the bone more than anything else, and I was worried about losing certain things. So if we go to the shading tab, this is what my shading tab looks like. So slightly different setup to get these results. In this case, this is if you saw my video on color swapping, where I was basically masking layers, this I'm not actually color swapping on. This is me just saying I wanted to paint these independently just because I'm a control freak. And I painted the base wood independent of the base bone, independent of the base stone, independent of my base leather, independent of this I actually ended up painting the chitin on the bottom, so it doesn't do anything. The only reason I did that, and if you're like, wait, this is sidetracking from the original topic, it is, but this is just to let you know that you could set it up this way if you were worried about overpainting onto something, and that's mainly the reason I did these layers. So I could paint a gradient, paint a gradient, paint a gradient, and paint a gradient without doing too much with my masking. And then up here, all of this gets processed with just the cavity and not it goes through the cavity map twice, one as just a base, drop me a color dodge, and the same cavity map again with a multiply that's been adjusted a little bit. So that is to say, play can get you a long way. And what did I achieve by this? So if I mute this color dodge node, it just looks a little flat. So this is just the color dodge straight off the cavity, not really adjusting anything. And it just kind of gives a little bit more punch to it. And this is the multiply node off of that, which is giving me, this is giving me some depths, but this is really popping out that sort of grungy look and the depth of the wood and the textures. So once again, just is also to say that this looks great on models with a lot of texture. The skin on the face, maybe it was a little difficult to see, but it really does add a lot of punch with something like this. And this is where I'm talking about you can play with the curves to, once again, get some interesting results in terms of what it's doing where and how. And it's honestly, it's just a fun little game I can play. So that looks awful. I'm going back to my original settings with lots of undos. And there we are. So once again, just kind of showing you what you can do, what you can achieve with just a little bit of cavity map and a little bit of peak map. In this case, I didn't use the peak map at all. I just used a cavity map. In the mole model, I used both a peak and a cavity map, but I think it would really have benefited from having those peak and cavity maps masked off for the different materials where there's vastly different colors. And also the main model I showed you guys, which was my crazy sort of Shogothian horror that can become a lot of things, whether it's a void spawn or any number of fun creations. So yeah, hopefully. I know I've sort of rambled on a bit, as I often do, but hopefully this has been helpful. And if you are nervous about painting and getting a lot of details, this is really just to show you don't have to have a lot of the details in place in terms of highlighting and shadowing, because you can achieve a lot with just a simple gradient and a cavity map. So this is mainly just to show you that if you've been daunted by painting in Blender and are like, oh, I don't have time to do painting and fake dry brushing in a 3D space, well, just slap on a gradient, paint the main color differences, and toss on a cavity map, and you can get some awesome results. So hopefully this has been helpful and you've learned something that you'll have fun with in the future. And have fun out there and take care.